As developers, we pour so much of our energy and, well, our trust into the digital environments we live in every day.
Hmm.
Our coding tools.
Yeah, you really do. You rely on them completely.
Exactly. It makes you wonder what happens when that trust gets exploited. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a pretty concerning threat that was recently uncovered. It specifically targets developers using the Cursor AI code editor, particularly on macOS.
Right. And what's really interesting, or maybe alarming about this one, is how it uses a tool that's actually designed to help. Cursor AI, it's gotten pretty popular, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
As an IDE, an integrated development environment.
Yeah.
Because it's got all these AI features built right in. It gives you tiered access to language models like Claude, Gemini, GPT-4.
Mm,
And it looks like that tiered access, the cost involved, is kind of central to how the attackers are operating here.
absolutely. And before we really get into the weeds, just a quick word about our sponsor, Stonefly. They are leaders in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions too.
Really crucial stuff in today's world.
Totally. So if the security of your data is, top of mind for you, and you're maybe looking into secure ransomware-proof storage things like air-gap systems, completely isolated, or immutable storage that just can't be changed.
Which is becoming so important.
It really is. Then you should definitely reach out to Stonefly. That's sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo. Okay, so let's unpack this whole Cursor AI situation. Our goal today is, well, to really understand how these malicious packages work, what the potential risks actually are, and maybe what we can learn about broader software supply chain security from this.
Okay. So the whole thing kind of kicked off when some security researchers, the SOC threat research team actually, found three suspicious packages floating around in the NPM ecosystem, the node package manager.
Right, where everyone gets their JavaScript tools.
Exactly. And these packages were called sw-cur, swic1, and aiide-cur. What jumped out straight away was, well, their disguise. They were pretending to be developer tools.
How so?
They were advertising themselves as offering the cheapest Cursor API, which, immediately sets off alarm bells.
Yeah, that old saying, right? If it sounds too good to be true.
It usually is. Classic lure.
The cheapest Cursor API. I can see how that would be tempting, definitely. And it looks like it worked, unfortunately. These packages, they were linked to threat actors using aliases like GTR 2018 and AIDE.
Mm-hmm. And some pretty sketchy-looking email addresses associated with them, too.
Yeah, like a QQ.com address and an Outlook.com one. But the really scary part is these weren't just, slightly dodgy tools. They were actual backdoors designed to give attackers unauthorized access.
Precisely. And the scale wasn't insignificant either. When they were found, these things had already been downloaded over 3,200 times.
Wow.
And what's maybe even more worrying is that they were still live on the NPM registry at that point.
Mhm.
Just highlights how tough it can be to, spot and pull down this kind of malicious stuff quickly from these big repositories.
That is concerning. Okay, so let's get into the mechanics. How did these packages actually compromise the Cursor IDE? Can you sort of walk us through the steps?
Sure. So the attack chain really starts the second a developer installs one of these packages. There's code embedded in them that immediately tries to harvest any Cursor credentials the user might have entered.
Okay, credential theft right off the bat.
Right. And once they have those, the package then phones home, connects to infrastructure the attackers control to download a second payload, a more potent one.
And I'm guessing that payload isn't just sitting there in plain text.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
To make it harder to spot, it's encrypted. Standard practice, really, to avoid easy detection.
Encrypted, right. Makes sense. So they download this encrypted file, then what?
Then comes the decryption and decompression part. The malicious code then specifically targets a really critical file inside the Cursor application structure on macOS. It's the main.js file.
Main.js. Where's that located?
It's in applications cursor.app contents resource app extensions cursor always local dist. Basically, this main.js file is, well, it's what runs the whole Cursor application.
Ah, okay. The core engine, essentially.
Pretty much. And the goal is to swap out that legitimate file with a backdoored version that the attackers control.
Overwriting a core application file, that's pretty bold. And yeah, I can see how that gives them persistent access.
Exactly. And one of the packages, sw-cur, went a little bit further. It also disabled Cursor's own auto-update mechanism.
Oh, that's clever. And nasty.
Yeah, because it stops the compromised IDE from getting fixed automatically by a legitimate update.
Yeah.
So the backdoor sticks around longer.
Right, keep store open.
And another interesting detail, all 3 packages, after they did their modifications, would restart the cursor application.
Why restart it?
Well, it seems like an innocent enough action, maybe prompts the user to do it, but it's actually crucial. It activates the backdoor they just injected when the application loads back up.
Sneaky. Okay, so the picture's getting clear. Steal credentials, download a hidden encrypted payload, tamper with the application's core file, maybe disable updates, and then restart to activate. Let's dive a bit deeper into the technical side. Where were the stolen credentials actually sent?
So for the sw-cur and sw-cur1 packages, the data went to command control servers, C2 servers, at cursor.sw2031.com.
Okay.
Interestingly, if you actually went to that domain, it just showed a generic login page called element admin. Probably just camouflage,
Stuff's all boring, yeah. And the other package, aiide-cur.
That one used a different C2 aide.xy Apologin.
Got it. And the encrypted payload itself, where did that come from?
For sw-cur, it was downloaded from tsw2031.com. And for aiide-cur, it came from api.aide.xyz.
Okay.
Now here's a really telling technical detail. All 3 of these packages use the exact same AES decryption key, a 32-byte key.
The exact same key for all 3.
Yep. AIDE-F2AE9C4B7 D6Melon3K5N1 PDOR8 AE7 T66U5V4. It's identical across the board.
Wow. That strongly suggests they're all connected, right? Same actor or group, or at least a very coordinated campaign.
Absolutely. It points to a certain level of organization and sophistication that, unfortunately, we're seeing more and more in these supply chain attacks. It's not just random opportunism.
That's not a comforting thought. So after they decrypt this payload with that shared key, what happens to the original legitimate main.js? Do they just delete it?
No, they're a bit more subtle. Before overwriting it, the malicious script actually makes a backup of the original main.js, usually just renames it to something like main.js.bake.
Okay, so there's a backup.
Then it takes the stolen user credentials it harvested earlier and injects them into the decrypted malicious payload.
Ah, so the backdoor now has the user's credentials embedded in it.
Potentially, yeah, or at least uses them to establish its own session. Then it writes this modified backdoored version over the original main.js file. This means the attacker's code is now running inside the trusted cursor process with all its privileges.
Right, a seamless replacement from the outside, but with a nasty payload inside. You mentioned earlier there were slight differences in how they handled persistence, keeping the backdoor active.
Yeah, just small variations in the tactics.
Yeah.
The sw-cur package, as we said, was the most aggressive. It disabled auto updates, and it actively tried to kill other cursor-related processes, like something called Chrome Crash Pad Handler.
Why kill processes?
Probably to make absolutely sure that the tampered version would load cleanly on the next restart, without any interference from lingering legitimate processes.
Okay. And the other two, sw-cur1 and aiide-cur.
They took a slightly softer approach. They skipped disabling the auto updates and didn't kill processes. Instead, they just prompt the user, hey, you need to restart cursor for this change to take effect, or something similar.
Ah, relying on the user to activate the backdoor for them.
Exactly. Which, most users would probably do without thinking twice if they just installed something that claimed to enhance cursor. Different paths, but the same end result. Persistent, malicious code running in the IDE.
Right. Okay, let's circle back to that lure the cheapest API thing. The motivation seems obvious, saving money. But can you break down why that specific claim is so effective for developers using Cursor?
Well, like we touched on, Cursor AI uses these powerful models, right? And using them isn't always free. There are tiers, usage costs.
Right, like pay-as-you-go or different subscription levels.
Exactly. And while you can plug in your own API keys sometimes, some developers are always looking for, cheaper ways. Maybe they're indie devs, maybe just budget conscious.
Or maybe trying to get around company restrictions, perhaps.
Could be. So the promise of a cheapest API, an unofficial way to access those features for less, is really appealing. The attackers just exploited that very predictable desire to save money.
It really hammers home that old warning, if it looks too good to be true, especially in places like package managers.
It almost certainly is. It's social engineering, basically, targeting a specific financial pain point for developers.
And it clearly worked, getting thousands of downloads. So let's talk impact. What does it actually mean if your IDE gets compromised like this? For just an individual developer, what are the biggest risks?
For an individual, the risks are pretty immediate and quite severe. First off, credential theft. Their cursor credentials are gone. Attackers could use those to access paid services, maybe rack up charges.
Okay, that's bad enough.
But it gets worse. Because the IDE is compromised, the attackers potentially have access to any code the developer opens in Cursor. Any proprietary code, any client projects, any open source contributions,
Everything.
pretty much everything they work on. And because this malicious code is running with the user's privileges inside a trusted app, it can do other things too. It could silently exfiltrate code or other sensitive files. It could install more malware, ransomware, spyware, anything.
That's terrifying. Your main tool, the thing you build with, turned into a weapon against you.
Precisely.
And what about scaling that up? What are the dangers for, say, a company or a big open source project if one of their developers gets hit by this?
Oh, the implications there are huge. You could have proprietary source code, a company's crown jewels leaked. Imagine that getting into the hands of competitors or criminals.
Yeah, devastating.
Attackers could also use that compromised IDE to inject malicious dependencies into the company's software builds. So now the company is shipping malware to its own customers. That's a classic supply chain attack vector.
A nightmare scenario.
And then there's the foothold aspect. That one compromised developer machine can become the attacker's entry point to move laterally inside the company's network. Maybe they get into the CI/CD pipeline, internal servers, other critical systems.
So it starts with one IDE, but it could spread much further.
Exactly. And remember that disabled auto-update feature. That means this kind of backdoor could sit there undetected for potentially a long time, just quietly causing damage or waiting for the right moment.
The potential for long-term, widespread damage is definitely significant. This whole incident, it feels like it fits into a pattern we keep hearing about these software supply chain attacks becoming more common, more sophisticated. How does this Cursor attack fit into that bigger picture?
It aligns perfectly, unfortunately. Researchers like Lucija Valentich at Reversing Labs have been documenting this rise in attacks, especially via package managers like NPM. But what's maybe newer, or at least becoming more prominent, is this direct targeting of the developer's tools, the IDE itself.
So not just poisoning the libraries, but poisoning the workshop.
Kind of, yeah. It represents this shift towards what some are calling patch-based compromise. It's a stealthier way in.
Patch-based compromise. That sounds subtle. Can you explain that a bit more? Why is it so concerning?
Well, instead of putting outright malware directly into a package that gets installed, the idea is you use a seemingly harmless package. Maybe one that offers a small utility, like our cheapest API example. But its real purpose is to modify legitimate software that's already installed and trusted on the developer's machine, like Cursor.
Ah, so it's modifying something already trusted rather than being inherently malicious itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because the malicious logic ends up running inside the context of that trusted application, like the Cursor IDE process, it inherits all of that application's trust and permissions.
So it blends in better.
Much better. It's harder for security software to flag because it's operating from within a legitimate process. And it can potentially persist even if the user realizes the initial package was bad and uninstalls it, because the damage to the trusted application is already done.
That is really clever, but yeah, deeply concerning. It really exploits the fundamental trust we have to place in our core development tools.
Okay, so let's say someone listening is thinking, uh-oh, maybe I installed one of those packages. What should they do right now? And maybe more broadly, what can developers do proactively to avoid this kind of thing?
Right. If you suspect you might have been compromised by one of these specific Cursor packages, the absolute first step is get rid of the compromised version. Uninstall Cursor completely. Then reinstall it using a fresh, verified installer directly from the official Cursor source. Don't trust any potentially modified versions.
Okay, clean slate. What else?
Credentials. Immediately rotate any credentials that might have been used within Cursor or associated services while you might have been compromised. Assume they were stolen.
Better safe than sorry.
Absolutely. And then you really need to do some auditing. Check your source control, get history, etc. for any strange commits or changes you don't recognize. Look at your build artifacts, too, for any signs of tampering that might have happened during that period. Diligence is key there. Okay, that's the reactive part. What about prevention? How do we stop this from happening again?
Prevention involves, well, multiple layers. Security tools are becoming increasingly important here. The team that found this, Socket, they offer tools specifically designed to detect and block these kinds of malicious packages before they get installed or run.
How do those tools work?
They often analyze package behavior in real time. They look for red flags like, does this package suddenly ask for credentials during install? Is it trying to access sensitive parts of the file system, like application directories it shouldn't touch? Is it making weird network calls to suspicious domains?
So behavioral analysis, not just signature matching.
Exactly. It's about understanding what the code does, not just what it looks like. Many of these tools also integrate into your workflow, like as a GitHub app, checking your dependencies, a command line tool you run locally, or even a browser extension warning you about risky packages.
Having those checks built into the process seems crucial. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. This specific cursor attack highlights vulnerabilities, but protecting code is a much bigger topic. Beyond just avoiding bad packages, what are some general strategies for protecting source code itself?
Yeah, source code protection is a whole discipline. It's really about implementing a range of measures to keep your code safe from unauthorized access, theft, or misuse. This involves things like encryption or obfuscation to
Yeah.
make the code harder for someone to just grab and understand or reverse engineer.
Right.
It means using secure repositories like Git hosts with proper access controls,
Right.
actively monitoring for vulnerabilities or breaches, and even using legal tools like clear licensing and copyright.
So it's technical, procedural, and legal. Why is it so important?
Well, several reasons. Protecting your intellectual property, obviously.
Yeah.
Preventing software piracy. Avoiding situations where attackers exploit flaws in your code to distribute malware. Maintaining the stability and reliability of your applications. Ensuring data privacy for your users if your code handles sensitive data. And often, meeting regulatory compliance requirements like GDPR or IRA.
Makes sense. It touches on a lot of critical business aspects. How do tools like data loss prevention, DLP, fit into protecting source code?
DLP tools can be really helpful here. They're designed to monitor, detect, and block sensitive data. And source code definitely qualifies as sensitive data from leaving your organization's control without authorization.
So they watch the exits, basically.
Yeah, and the internal movement too. They can identify and classify code based on sensitivity, lets you set policies on who can access or share it, monitor activity, block unauthorized transfers like copying to a USB drive or emailing it out and alert you to problems. Some can even encrypt code at rest or in transit.
So they add another layer of control and visibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Regular scans with DLP can also help find code stored in insecure places you didn't even know about, and they usually tie into incident response processes.
That layered approach, again, seems like a constant theme in security. You can't just rely on one thing. Now, even with these protections, you mentioned vulnerabilities within the code itself can be a problem. What are some common examples that undermine protection efforts?
Oh, there are many, unfortunately.
Uh-huh.
Classic ones include things like buffer overflows, where you write too much data to a memory spot, potentially allowing code execution.
Right.
Injection flaws are huge. SQL injection is the most famous, letting attackers mess with your database queries. Cross-site scripting, or XSS, lets attackers inject malicious scripts into web pages that other users see.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's cross-site request forgery, CSRF, insecure direct object references, like easily guessable IDs for resources, security misconfigurations, unvalidated redirects that can send users to malicious sites, accidentally exposing sensitive data in the code itself, like hard-coded passwords. And a really big one today, using third-party libraries or components that have known vulnerabilities you haven't patched.
That last one sounds like the supply chain issue again, just from a different angle.
It absolutely is. It all ties together.
It really emphasizes the need for good coding practices from the start. What are some key best practices developers should follow for better code protection and security?
Secure coding practices are foundational. Writing code defensively to avoid those common flaws we just listed. Regular, thorough code reviews are essential. Having another pair of eyes, ideally security-focused eyes, look at the code.
Okay.
Using established security libraries and frameworks that handle things like input validation or authentication securely for you. Running static analysis, SAST, and dynamic analysis, BAST, tools to automatically scan your code for potential issues.
SAST and DAST. All right.
Following the principle of least privilege, making sure your application only has the permissions it absolutely needs. Rigorous input validation and output encoding are critical to stop injection and XSS attacks, keeping everything past your OS, your libraries, your frameworks, encrypting sensitive data both at rest and in transit, using strong authentication and managing sessions securely.
Lots to cover.
It is. And developer training is key too, making sure everyone understands these risks and practices. Securing your code repositories, as we mentioned, regular testing, including penetration testing, to proactively find weaknesses, and crucially, having an incident response plan ready before something bad happens.
Okay, you mentioned incident response plans there, and that feels really relevant after talking about backdoors and compromises. Can you briefly explain what an incident response plan and IRP is and why it's so important?
Sure. An IRP is basically a documented playbook. It's formally approved, and it guides the organization on how to prepare for, detect, contain, eradicate, and recover from a security incident.
So a plan for when things go wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It clarifies who does what roles and responsibilities and outlines the steps to take before, during, and after an incident. A big part is training staff just to recognize and report suspicious things.
Right, the human element.
Absolutely. And during an actual incident, you need designated roles like an incident manager to coordinate, a technical manager for the nitty-gritty, a communications manager to handle messaging. And maybe most importantly, after the dust settles, you need a blameless retrospective.
Blameless.
Yeah, the goal isn't to point fingers. It's to figure out what happened, why it happened, and how to improve the people, the processes, the technology, so it doesn't happen again, or so you handle it better next time.
That structured approach makes a lot of sense for dealing with, well, what seems increasingly inevitable. Now, earlier we touched on attackers moving around after they get in, lateral movement. Can you explain that concept a bit more? Why is it so dangerous?
Lateral movement is what attackers do after the initial breach. They got a foothold on one machine, maybe the developer's laptop in our cursor example. Now they want to explore. They move sideways or laterally through the network from that initial point,
Looking for what?
looking for more valuable targets. Maybe sensitive data stores, domain controllers for higher privileges, critical servers, other user accounts. It's dangerous because it turns a single compromised machine into potentially a full network infiltration. It lets them escalate privileges and find the real crown jewels. And they often try to blend in with normal network traffic, making it hard to spot.
So, using the internal pathways to spread, what kind of techniques do they use for this?
All sorts. They might use internal spear phishing, sending targeted emails within the network. Credential theft is huge, using tools like Mimikatz to scrape passwords or hashes from memory. Then there are techniques like pass the hash or pass the ticket, which let them authenticate as users on other machines without needing the actual password. They abuse legitimate tools all the time. PowerShell is a big one for remote command execution. Remote admin tools like PSEX or RDP are common targets. Exploiting vulnerabilities in network services on Linux or macOS, maybe SSH hijacking. Even just using standard Windows file shares, admin shares.
A whole toolkit for moving around unnoticed. How do you even detect that?
It's tricky. You look for anomalies, weird login times or locations, known attack tools suddenly appearing on systems, spikes and alerts from intrusion detection systems, lots of failed login attempts across different accounts, unusual network traffic patterns between machines that don't normally talk, admins using tools they don't typically use. It requires good monitoring and baseline understanding of what's normal.
Sounds like finding a needle in a haystack sometimes. Okay, finally, let's come back to the core of the cursor incident, the backdoor. What exactly is a backdoor attack, and what can attackers do with one?
A backdoor is just what it sounds like, a hidden way in. It's a method to access a system or data that bypasses all the normal security checks, logins, firewalls, etc. Sometimes developers might leave them in intentionally, maybe for debugging, which is risky.
Yeah, sounds risky.
But more often, attackers either exploit existing ones or, like in the cursor case, install their own backdoor as part of the attack. Malware itself often acts as a first-stage backdoor. Think of a web shell on a server giving remote command execution.
Right, and once they have that backdoor access.
They can do pretty much anything the system permissions allow. Steal data, obviously, conduct fraudulent transactions, install more malware rootkits to hide deeper, spyware, ransomware, launch denial of service attacks using the compromised system, hijack servers for botnets or crypto mining, deface websites. It gives them persistent hidden control. The consequences can be really severe, leading to major breaches and significant harm.
A hidden entry point that bypasses security.
Yeah, that's a fundamentally alarming idea. Okay, so bringing this deep dive toward a close, we've really dissected a quite sophisticated attack targeting developer tools themselves. It just hammers home how critical it is to be vigilant about the software we trust, the packages we install, especially in our development workflows.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, the potential fallout isn't small. It ranges from individual credential theft right up to potentially compromising entire organizations or critical open source projects.
It's a really stark reminder, isn't it? The cyber threat landscape just keeps evolving, and we constantly need to adapt our security thinking and practices, whether you're an individual developer or a large enterprise. Secure coding, vigilant monitoring, solid incident response. It's all crucial.
It really is. Trusting our tools is necessary to get work done, but it has to be, maybe, a trust but verify approach. Continuously verifying and reinforcing that trust. Well said. And on that note, we want to thank our sponsor again, Stonefly. Seriously, if your data security is a priority, and it should be, and you're considering secure, ransomware-proof storage, things like air-gapped or immutable solutions, do check them out.
Definitely worth looking into those options.
Reach out to Stonefly at sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo. It really is a vital step in protecting your critical assets in this environment. And thank you for joining us for this deep dive today. We hope exploring this Cursor AI incident has given you some valuable insights.